My name is Bill Moyer. I direct Backbone campaign and lead the Solutionary Rail campaign. And Solutionary Rail is part of the Moving Forward network. And I want to now pass the baton to my cohort and collaborator, Diane Whitner, who's out in Baltimore, to introduce herself and then introduce our special guests.
Great. Thank you, Bill. My name is Diane Whitner, and welcome to Solutionary Perspectives, which is an interview series with Solutionary Rail stakeholders and allies. I'm joined by Bill Moyer, as you saw. Well, tonight we have quite a treat. Our guests are from Little Village Environmental Justice Organization, or LVEJO, based in a Mexican-American neighborhood in Chicago called Little Village. LVEJO provides leadership development for the sustainable self-determination of local residents. LVEJO is perhaps best known for its successful campaign to close 2 coal power plants, whose toxic emissions had been linked to thousands of residents' health emergencies, including deaths, every year. This is, including children and the elderly. So on this 5th anniversary year of the coal power plant shutdown with new campaigns, LVEJO continues to be a national model of the practice of just transition and environmental justice that is community and resident-led. So we'll speak first with Kimberly Wasserman-Nieto, LVEJO's executive director. So Kim is the executive director of LVEJO, where she has worked since 1998. Kim joined LVEJO as an organizer and helped to organize community leaders to successfully build, here's a great list, you all, a new playground, community gardens, remodel of a local school park, and force a local polluter to upgrade their facilities to meet current laws. And as executive director of LVEJO, she has worked with organizers to reinstate a job access bus line, build on the recent victory of a new 23-acre park to be built in Little Village. Maybe that's built, but we'll find out. And continue the 10-year-plus campaign that won the closure of the 2 local coal power plants to fight for remediation and redevelopment of the sites in a way that works for the community. That's key. Mrs. Wasserman is chair of the Illinois Environmental Justice Commission. And in 2013, I'll say Kim, was the recipient of the Goldman Prize for North America. But her biggest accomplishment to date is raising 3 community organizers, ages 18, 11, and 8. So Kim, we're going to start with you. Please tell us about LVEJO and how the principles of just transition and environmental justice, which are key from what I can tell, how these inform your organization's current campaigns. And I'm thinking particularly of 3 campaigns. The first is plans for the old Crawford coal plant site, new challenges to community redevelopment, including gentrification and displacement issues. And the third one is the Future Energy Jobs Act of Illinois. I know that's a lot, but please talk to us. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. Can you all hear me okay? Perfect. So thank you both to Diane and Bill. It's a super honor to be able to share in our story and share space with you all and be able to talk with folks across the country. So as was mentioned, we've been around for 20 plus years as an organization, and I think our principles, both of environmental justice, but also just transition, have really been key to both helping us win, but also just helping us really understand what's at stake in the work that we do. As a frontline community, a lot of times our work around like the coal power plant and fighting for clean air because we couldn't breathe, and fighting because our children had asthma, right? That we didn't set off with the goals of necessarily environmental justice in mind. We set off with the goals of just being able to breathe in mind. And through this process, we're able to learn and understand that our work was based in environmental justice and that it could be principled. And winning the campaigns to build the 23-acre park that took us 20 years, but in 2014 we were able to build the park and have it opened, which we were very happy about. Winning the campaigns for the bus, thank you, and the coal power plant and the park gave us an opportunity really to take a step back and really just start to ask ourselves, right, like how do we as a community end up in these situations? How is it that we had to react to all of these things happening in our neighborhood, right? Reacting to the coal power plant, reacting to not having a park, reacting to not having bus service, right? How do we get on the front end of these conversations, right? And who makes these decisions, right? Because somebody somewhere made the decision to do these things or not do these things. And we wanted to understand, right, how does that happen? And really what we found was that as an organization rooted in environmental justice, that a lot of what we were talking about was land use, right? That the coal power plant needed to have land. Our community needs to have land, right? And so who makes the decisions about how that land, who makes the decisions about land use and what the best use of it is? And again, through our experience of shutting down the coal power plant and now being left with what we call an industrial legacy, a site that isn't making any money for the owner, for the city, and is just a reminder of the injustice that has happened on that site, right? When we think of that site, we think of what are the things as a community that we want to write to. We want to write to a just transition. How do we transition, as I mentioned, from a site of injustice to justice, right? What are the strengths that we have as a community that we can build on to repower this site in a different capacity? And so both the environmental justice principles really helped us start to think about what do principles of land use look like, right? What does it look like to equitably develop land? And thinking about our strengths as a community, thinking about what we're good at, that's what we set out to do. And so as a neighborhood, we knew that we want living wage jobs. We knew that we wanted these spaces to provide healthy and safe jobs, not just for our community, but for the workers inside of them. We recognize that as a community, we have a really strong food system. In Little Village, ironically, there are 160 restaurants, and 60% of all food vendors from across the city of Chicago come from our neighborhood. But in our neighborhood, we don't have a single commercial kitchen where these folks need access to in order to be legally licensed in the city of Chicago. And so as of 2018 or 2017, there's a licensee permit now for street vendors. Not a single person has applied for it because there's no access to commercial kitchens, right? And so that economic benefit is really for who? It's not for our people, right? And so really trying to understand what are the connections we can make. And as an organization, we historically know that we have a strong urban, and I say quote, urban agriculture skill set. A lot of our folks who immigrate from Mexico and other spaces come, I think we found in a study we did that I think 60% of community members come with some kind of agricultural background, right? But when they come here, that doesn't transfer, right? They're doing assembly line work, they're truck drivers, they're doing a plethora of other things that aren't necessarily related to their skill set. And so as an organization that uses food and community gardens at the heart of its organizing, right? We were like, how do we get folks reconnected with the earth? How do we get folks reconnected with growing their food? It's a skill set they have, it's a strength that they have. And so for the last 20 years, we've been developing community gardens in Little Village, really as an organizing tool, but later on understanding that this was a just transition for our neighborhood, that folks in our neighborhood want to figure out how to grow on a larger scale, on a farming scale, want to figure out how to tap into the economic market for local foods. The policy world is creating space in Chicago for local food procurement. So what does it look like in our neighborhood, right? To not only have 60% of the food vendors, but possibly have the food producers as well, right? And part of our work as an organization has also been struggling to access organic dirt. In a city like Chicago, it's not like it's everywhere, right? You have to pay a pretty penny to access organic dirt. Otherwise, you get conventional dirt, which when you're trying to do organic farming doesn't work. And so our community came together, and again, using that agricultural background, many years ago, decided that worm composting would be something that they would get into, and over the years have collectively mastered the skill of worm composting and are collectively thinking about how do they now tap into a local market to create organic soil locally. They need the compost and scraps from local restaurants. So we surveyed all 160 restaurants. Turns out they're interested in giving us their scraps as long as we give them a bucket and tell them what to do and train their staff, right? So literally, if we can create a closed food system in Little Village that taps into the grower, the buyer, the composter, right? That's an economic generation that could be housed on a former coal power plant. That's building on economic development that's local, right? On the assets that are local. It's not imposing on us an economy that it's extractive or an economy that puts the health of our people and the health of our community, both as workers and residents, on the line. And that's really the conversation that we look for when we talk about our work being principled in environmental justice and in just transition, is that we have certain expectations, and we will no longer as a community just be satisfied with crumbs, because we recognize that our lives and our communities are not worth crumbs, they're worth gold. And so we expect, recently we've been saying a lot, like we expect not only to be decision makers, we expect to be at the table, and we expect to be served just like everybody else. We expect the same level of service when it comes to true involvement in what it means to make decisions in our neighborhood. And so that's not only a challenge we face with like the redevelopment of the coal power plant, right, which is taking something from an extractive coal economy and maybe completely redeveloping it under a food system, right, and in a very different economy. And I should preface by saying that all of the models that I talk about, we aim for under a cooperative model, right? Our community is very clear that they want to figure out how do they jointly own these things, right? How do they come together? Again, not an extractive economy, but an inclusive economy. And what does that look like? And for a lot of us in our home countries, a cooperative economy is what holistically brings up a community. And that's really what folks are hungry for, right? Is that's what they're looking for. So when it comes to the Crawford Coal Power Plant, it's not only changing the mentality for that site, but also changing that mentality across the board in Little Village. While we may have one idea of what our economic development should look like, let's be clear that the city of Chicago also has its own ideas of what economic development look like. And since we have been successful in cleaning up the air by shutting down the coal power plant, and we were successful in developing more open space by fighting for a 23-acre park, and we were successful in getting better public transit by advocating for the bus, we also recognize that that opened up the opportunity for other investments in our neighborhood that could potentially both benefit us and hurt us. And the city was like, oh, look at clean air, more open space, more public transit, right? What else can we capitalize here from this community? And it's interesting because number one is those improvements in our neighborhood have set off the want for displacement and gentrification, right? So right now, Little Village, I believe, is 60% renters in our community, right? So when the city of Chicago sees that, automatically the thought process is, how do we get rid of the renters and bring in the homeowners who can pay higher property taxes, right? Who can be homeowners, right? And how do we displace that renter who is only minimum wage probably, right? Or is on the lower end of the economy? And so we as a neighborhood were like, wait a minute, we didn't fight to improve our neighborhood to be pushed out of our neighborhood now and not enjoy the fruits of our labor, right? And so how do we develop our neighborhood in a manner that doesn't displace our folks? And really what we found is the answer was in our own work. In 2014, when the park was built, because that was very much a community-led process and community-invested process, we spent 5 years designing that park. And then we spent another 2 years negotiating with the park district because we weren't happy with the processes and the way they were doing things. So what we did is we fought back and we prolonged the process 7 years. Not a single family who lives around the park has been displaced because of rising property tax values around that park, right? Because the narrative was very different, right? It was very clear who the audience for this park was and how they needed to be protected. Those are the types of conversations we want to have on any development that happens in our neighborhood. Is we want to figure out how do we think about community development from a space of principle and inclusivity and equity. And lastly, what I'll say is that's really what we had in mind in fighting for the Future Energy Jobs Act of Illinois, right? That was our first.
Can you say those 3 words again?
Sure. Sorry. The Future Energy Jobs Act of Illinois. FEJA, FEJA, is the acronym. And that really was our first rodeo into the policy world, like legit as an organization.
And wasn't that just in 2016?
Yes, actually this past year, yes, 2016 through 2017 and up until now, yeah.
Cool.
And so as an organization, just like we were having, I think, like moments of clarity about community development, right. We were also having moments of clarity around how unjust policy, right, was also affecting us as an organization, right? Having these wins allowed us as an organization to kind of elevate our reach as an organization to understand, like, not only what were the policy decisions that were being made in our neighborhood that were increasing the diesel, increasing the transportation, right? But also, what were some of the environmental policies that were not catching some of these issues in the process? What were some of the policy gaps that were allowing for environmental justice communities like ours, who had fought for all of these things, to now not only be at the heart of gentrification and displacement, but also the city is kind of having a split personality this moment, because on one hand they're saying, yes, let's displace these renters, let's bring in homeowners, but on the other hand they recognize that our industrial corridor is actually really viable, and that's not by accident. That's because in our city we're located right off of the I-55 expressway, the Stevenson Expressway, which technically can take you all the way to Los Angeles. And as a city that sees 30% of all goods coming through its city, the route that these trucks take is very important. So all of a sudden, the city of Chicago also started to realize that we're strategically placed as a neighborhood. And so how do they get the biggest bang for their bucks? Let's displace everybody, bring in homeowners, and not just any homeowners who are going to be okay living in the heart of a diesel, diesel hotspot in Chicago, right? And so it's just this, as I mentioned, the city just has these two plans that are just don't intersect with each other, right? They don't mix with each other, in the sense of, regardless of renters or homeowners, who wants to live in a neighborhood where there is tons of diesel trucks everywhere and the air quality goes back to being as bad, if not worse, to when the coal power plant was operating, right? And as a community who works from a space of principle, how do we ensure that future and current community developments are grounded in that to protect us as a community? And so given that perspective, as I mentioned, we started to look at policy that wasn't protecting us. Why were these things not being caught on a state level, on a city level? And what we were finding is that's because environmental justice in particular wasn't at the heart of policy in Springfield. The folks who were doing environmental policy in Springfield were okay with those folks who fell by the wayside. And those folks who fell by the wayside are communities like ours. And so we leveraged these successes to really try to build up a policy team at LVEJO. And 2 years ago, we were very fortunate to bring on Juliana Pino, our policy director, who just really, I think, strategically and single-handedly inserted her space in the policy arena in Illinois, and just was able to make some astronomical wins for environmental justice communities. That included things which, for other folks in other states, might be like, what? Like, that's where barely you're at in Illinois? And I should explain, we're in Illinois. Our last 3 governors have gone to jail. Like, let's be clear about the state that we represent, right? And the city that we represent as well. And so, we really wanted to ensure that environmental justice communities were at the heart of this opportunity to really encourage and bring about renewable energy and workforce development in Illinois. So some of the victories that we were able to get was the designation of environmental justice communities being first and foremost in line for any programs and incentives that came out of this bill. And secondly, lifting up formerly incarcerated communities and community members that come out of the foster care system as being the first in line to benefit as well from these services and programs. And so for us, this is the first in Illinois that those communities are being lifted up and held at the center of this work, along with environmental justice communities. And let me just say, as a person who was born and raised in Illinois, that's a hell of a long way to have come. And so, I'm super proud of the work that we've been able to do as an organization that's 20 plus year old, and just we're kind of we're just really, we stand our ground when it comes to the work that we do and the principles that we abide by, and it's definitely paying off.
Yeah, wow, incredible work.
So Kim, thank you so much. That's really incredible, an incredible long story, and I was pleasantly surprised to hear you go to composting and community gardens as based on the community's own cultural heritage that they bring to the United States. That's what a fantastic solution. And I know you've got your work cut out for you because it's not a clean site, but I was wondering, so we're now so excited to speak with Nancy Meza, and I have a whole introduction here, but I was wondering, Kim, would you like to introduce Nancy to discuss Nancy's work in particular, particularly the Unilever campaign, its history and how things are going?
Absolutely, I would be truly honored to.
Thank you.
So Nancy is, I think, just emblematic and just one of the reasons why I am super proud to do the work that I do and get up every morning to do the work that I do. Nancy is a young person who started with us at our organization through some nudging of her parents to come hang out with us and see what shenanigans she could get into with us. And I'm really proud to say that I think 2+ years later, she not only has come through our youth program, but she is now a community organizer on staff at LVEJO, leading one of the most important campaigns, I think, historically that we've ever run, which is our diesel campaign. When I mentioned earlier about folks recognizing the coal power plant shutting down and now this new source in our neighborhood and really wanting to understand, Nancy, as both, as an individual from the community, just took it on head on and has been able to do some amazing organizing in our community. And I'm just super proud to know her and to be able to work side by side with her in our community. So,
Right on. Nancy.
Nance, please tell us about the Unilever campaign. We've spoken with you about it before. We want to hear the history and latest news, opportunities and challenges and plans.
Oh, you are unmuted on our side, Nancy, but I'm not hearing you. No problem. But, oh, that sounds right. Might work.
Hi everyone, I'm Nancy. So these campaign started back in 2015. And it started off with Unilever trying to expand their manufacturing facility, and they've been in the neighborhood for about 100 years, so they've been there forever. But the city was particularly interested in figuring out how they were going to expand right next to an elementary school with about 1,000 children from kindergarten to 8th grade. So they started doing a lot of organizing. We actually, with the young people, did a rally right in front of one of our aldermen's office who approved the project, kind of trying to oppose it. But the project went on. There was, again, that trying to figure out how, how Unilever would expand right next to the school. So we have community meetings, educating the community about what PM 2.5 was, different health problems that were related to diesel. So we started educating with them folks, educating ourselves as well. And we were able to down in a few of the community meetings where it was not a priority. So it was our job and duty to come into these spaces and, talk about these topics that nobody else is talking about. Which is one of the for the approval of the Zapata expansion, because Unilever had for the school to expand, kind of to bribe, they say. But again, we went to that meeting, to that expansion, and when they're presenting the project, Zapata, the elementary school, there is nowhere on the map the Unilever side that there is like trees, something that's not there. So, the environment is not taken into consideration. So we did a lot of organizing, town hall meetings, and it got to the point where Unilever called us bullies for calling them out. So we're really, really happy for bullies because they were making noise. So I think that was one of the thing that surprised me the most. Yeah, I think we've been trying to work with Unilever, figuring out how we can work with truck drivers when it comes to converting their fees to a more renewable source. So it's something that's been in the works. We are figuring out how we can partner up with truck drivers, because we understand that people need those jobs, and with the expansion of Unilever, it is going to bring in jobs. So we want to make sure that those jobs are healthy, sustainable, and that our people have benefits, which is something that, it's not on writing, but it's something that we're pushing for. We also are doing air monitoring. We were able to partner up. Karen, who's our other organizer, is running our project. We're trying to figure out what our air is now and see how it might impact how these new trucks that are going to come in would impact our air quality. Like Tim mentioned, we have I-55, which is a major highway, but there is no information out there of how many trucks are in our neighborhood. And we've been conducting truck countings in the neighborhood. We're very lucky to partner up with one of our high schools, the Little Village along the high school, who did truck counting on one of, I would say, busiest institutions where they, for a semester, counted trucks. They were able to tell us that there were 1.3 trucks passing by that intersection every minute. And for us, that was very alarming. So we are continuing to do truck counting, trying to get that data, to also get our air monitoring data and figure out how, with all this data, we can go to the city and try to pass a policy or allow our air quality is taken into consideration.
Sorry to interrupt, Nancy. I mean, I think we're getting like 80% of this, and but there's because of a bandwidth. I'm wondering if you could continue for a few more minutes with this, but let's turn the video off. Let's see if we get more of the better audio. If that's okay. And so, does that make sense? Do you want to give that a try?
Yeah, can y'all hear me all right?
I think that works better.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Okay, so you were talking about the trucks and 1 per minute through the intersection, and the policy. You want to continue from there?
Yeah. Yeah. So they counted 1.3 trucks passing the intersection, only one intersection, 1.3 trucks every minute.
Wow.
And we are very curious to figure out what that number can look like in different parts of Little Village. It's an industrial, a lot of truck drivers. We also want to figure out if our infrastructure is even suitable for all these trucks to come through. They do have designated road areas, but because a lot of the truck drivers are coming from out of town, they might not know the areas, and they actually go through residential areas. So we've been doing a lot of work there. I should also mention Zapata Elementary School and the high school are actually located in industrial areas. So we are also trying to figure out how we can push policy to that take into consideration that a school maybe in an industrial area because of it. So we've been doing a lot of work around that. Yeah, I think that would be a good scope of the work we've been doing.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And Diane, go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Thank you. Nancy, I do have a question for you. What kind of organizing are you doing with the high school students? Before we transition to sort of these larger questions about emissions and all that, are they helping with the air quality monitoring?
We are doing outreach to students who would be interested in air monitoring, but I think the way we're tackling, getting students involved is trying to work with the teachers to work with their curriculum to see how maybe they can use their AP Stats class for truck hunting. So very much trying to work with teachers to get students interested, and these are all students who live in the neighborhood. So definitely trying to go with their needs and see how we can push forward our campaigns through the teachers and into students.
One other question did I read correctly that Hellman's has given money to that school?
Um, they they announced it to make it seem like they did, but they only donated I want to say 3 acres of land for the, but the land was not given clean. So then that would have to come from somewhere else if it's area remediated and prepared for the school that's going to be on it.
Okay, thank you. I was just curious because that's a complex topic when struggling schools get corporate money that they desperately need, or they get land. That complicates things further, and maybe that's a different subject for another time. But thank you so much for telling us about the campaign. I think it's fantastic that Unilever has noticed your work. It's a great sign, and that's a great start. So congratulations. And it's quite complex, that what you're describing to us, and it has many moving parts, and we look forward to keeping track of how you all are going to be addressing this complex topic, especially because, as you said, the truck drivers need jobs, and it's great that there are new factory jobs coming as well, but at what cost? And
Yeah,
to have these things next to two schools is quite the challenge. I would like to have us transition now to discussing diesel emissions and diesel pollution and zero emissions and opportunities for changing how we do transportation, particularly with trucks and trains, intermodal transportation. And Bill, I would like you to follow up with some questions here, please.
Sure. Well, I was just thinking it would be great to remind folks that one of the reasons and one of the things that we've learned from our work with the Moving Forward Network, we're repeatedly coming back to the connection between the decarbonization of freight transport using the trains, which was where we started from because of our opposition to coal and oil trains, but the intimate connection that has with trucks, and how the decarbonization of trucks in communities like Kansas City or Chicago or Long Beach is inseparable from the decarbonization and the shift in the economic model of freight in general in the country.
Absolutely.
And so I think it's fascinating to hear about the organizing that's coming from the communities that are impacted, and the incredible leadership and vision around from urban agriculture that we've seen evolving from Detroit to now what Kim was mentioning in Chicago, to the monitoring that is happening in, well, we heard in Kansas City. We know that there's monitoring in other places like I think Long Beach as well. And now Nancy was talking about the monitoring possibilities in Little Village. So I wonder if Nancy and Kim might take a little bit from your perspective of how does the decarbonization piece fit into your work, and what might we need to carry forward as we continue with this campaigning around railroads? Where's the places for collaboration and learning from your perspective?
Absolutely. So I'll say that in regards to the decarbonization, I think that where we land as a community is that we have thought to give to that conversation. You know, I can't say for other areas, but in Chicago at the very least, and in the Midwest, the conversation on what they call decarbonization is happening, and frontline communities are nowhere to be found in the conversation, right? Because our school of thought, our lack of experience, right, our lack of scholarly work apparently keeps us from participating in that conversation. Yet, as a frontline community, we have every right to participate in that conversation, given that we're at the front line of the impact of that work. And so I think that there lies the problem, and there as well lies the solution, is right. How do we work with folks like the Backbone Campaign and others, right, and Solutionary Rail, to think about what does it look like to bring these conversations together, right? What does that decarbonization agenda look like from a frontline and rail perspective, right? How do we start to join those conversations, because in Chicago, part of the struggle too is we have not like small roads, we have craters of work to do to build with our union brothers and sisters, to talk about this from a Teamsters perspective, to talk about this from a goods movement perspective, right? We're barely starting to scratch the surface of truck drivers, truck driver rights, and understanding in Little Village of what that means, right? And we see where the potential is, but we also have to recognize that folks have to want to come to the table and have these conversations. And if we're not having the jobs information, the electrification information, the steel, the use, right? If we don't have that information, then we're just talking pie in the sky to folks, right? And so that's where that partnership, I think, can come into play, is really to say, how do we nerd out together on those numbers, on that information, right? And use that as part of our narrative, right? Using our skill sets and what we bring to the table, right? And supporting the work that we're doing locally, understanding that it's going to be different for every city, right? Understanding Kansas City, Long Beach, Chicago, it's going to look very different, right? But bringing that to bear upon this conversation, right, is part of the work that we need.
I love that you said nerd out on this stuff, because I swear to God, I've totally felt like that for the last 3-4 years now, being surrounded by rail nerds constantly. You know, sorry, no offense to you guys on the call. Really, like Kim and I met, we're doing puppets in the streets of Chicago. So, you know, it's a little bit of a shift to all of a sudden do a thing on a book on railroads, but it is super helpful. I mean, and again, your leadership, you, like, one of the things we say around the Solutionary Rail is our no is only as powerful as our yes is compelling. And I mean, it's a pretty powerful no when people can't breathe in their own communities, you know, regardless. But it does, I think it is helpful that also from the community-based organizations, the leadership that you're showing is that you're always doing yes and no campaigns. I mean, you're from the composting and the worm bins to the kids programs to the art. I mean, and now you're talking about this hyper localization of food, and then also using the actual brownfield as a just transition site, place for actual ecological environmental healing. I mean, you're already leading. Obviously, you know that, but the whole world doesn't really always realize.
And what's interesting though is if you would ask me any other day of the week, is this just transition? I'd be like, I don't know what that means, but this is justice for us as a community, right? And I think we really try to think beyond just that extractive community. How are we talking about inclusive community? And that also includes like how we treat the earth, right? And so just to give you context, like when we talk about even brownfield remediation, we're taking it now to a place where we don't want to have an extractive economy where we have like shovels and bulldozers coming in to pull out dirt. How do we use plants and use phytoremediation and mushrooms to clean our land in a much more holistic manner, right? That allows us to bond with the earth a little bit better, right? We also need to be thinking about that when it comes to the goods that we use in our cities, right? What are our needs? What are the things that we need to transport, right? Also tying this to the question of consumerism, right? And how much right? So I think there's a lot of interconnection through this work. It's taking the time and the space to actually be thoughtful about making those, like this conversation is, and figuring out what does it look like to work across those silos.
Wow, great.
So this is Tim. I have a question for Kim. You had mentioned about deep decarbonization conversations and how your organizations weren't necessarily part of that conversation, unfortunately. I was just curious, who is it that is sponsoring those other conversations? I'm thinking here in terms of what would be some of the institutional barriers to break down to be able to get organizations like yours to be at the table.
Sure, and I think, you know, I'm not going to name names, but I can tell you there is Big Greens and very influential environmental policy spaces that are moving that conversation. And honestly, it's a question of like, just even like procedural justice, right? Like, how do you attain that type of framework, right? What's the construct that those conversations are going to come together, right? Like just starting from jump, like when folks come together to say, we want to figure this out, right? Frontline communities need to be centered in that work. And when that doesn't happen and documents are created and then given to community to say, let us know what you think, what we call like the EJ policing, right? Like there needs to be an understanding that process alone from jump, right? This is problematic. And so that's where we really push back is 99% of the time in the Midwest, at least, right? We are asked to react to something versus coming to the table at the very beginning when it's being put together. And we're hopeful that the process that FEJA took, to a certain extent, the future energy jobs bill, right, that some lessons can be learned from that and pulled from that about what does it look like to start to work with community from jump to start to think of some of these frameworks and processes. Hey, Bill, we can't hear you.
Bill, you're muted.
Oh, that's just like me. So I just wanted to let folks know that we are coming close to the end of this our time, and so I wanted to make sure that if anybody else had a question, they could ask that, or if Nancy or yourself wanted to make some additional commentary or closing remark, to be able to do that. So first, I guess I'll open it to, are there any burning questions from folks who are joining on the call? And I really appreciate Tim's question to give us the opportunity to really look at what are some of the obstacles.
Mm-hmm.
But, I'm not hearing anything from, I think everybody's cool. So I think we'd just love to hear if Nancy or Kim, if you have any closing thoughts or advice as we go forward and hopefully forward together, yeah.
Well, I'll jump in, Nancy. Please feel free to jump in at any point in time too. No, I think first and foremost, just again, thank you for the opportunity. I had definitely my experience of, and the reason I said nerding out about transit is because in our transit campaign, I got to meet a lot of the Chicago transit folks, right, who are very passionate about this work. And as an organizer, trying to figure out how do you balance the research and the facts and the stats, right, with the need that community has on the ground. And so it's just a particular space that I hold very true to my heart. And so I appreciate being in this space. I can only imagine the amount of information that folks around the table have to bring to bear upon this conversation. And so I would just say that I think that, have patience with us. It's a lot, but we want to hear it. We want to work with you guys. And I think just based on my history with you, Bill, alone, the love is there, and we have mad respect for the work that you guys do, and, appreciate your solidarity greatly. When people didn't believe in us that we were going to shut down the coal power plant, there you were with your band and your puppets and, helping us out. And so I just think that that's, a reminder of what true solidarity looks like and how do we continue that path forward, because that's what we need truly to be able to kick the ass that we need to kick to get the wins that we want. So,
amen. That's what we need to kick the asses. We need to get kicked. Thank you. Yeah, well, so much love to you and so much gratitude for all the years of interacting and solidarity. And I'm looking forward to building upon this much more. And yeah, it's really fascinating going into this stuff like railroads. It's every time I go into a room, I'm surrounded by people who know way more about trains than I do.
yeah.
And yet it's cool, right? Because it's like the welders in the community or the other people.
Absolutely.
Everybody has something of value to bring to build this new society.
Absolutely.
And, I have to say what I've noticed, just as somebody who's sort of been paying attention to trains over many years, because I've always loved them, and I've always been like one of the few people who takes these long distance train rides everywhere around this continent. When I'm done with each one, I think, what was I thinking, But what's fascinating to me and what needs to change is that there are so many rail nerds. And I am just because I like to sit on the train and look out the window and so forth. But there are all these people who have all this tech knowledge. I think that their struggle, my impression for people working, let's say, to bring more funding to Amtrak, for instance, if you just think about passenger rail, my distinct impression is that going from being the nerds to changing policy at any level, I think there's been this chasm. You know, I don't know what metaphor I want to use here, but it hasn't worked. You know, all different skills and a whole range of tactics need to happen to move this forward in different places at different levels, because there are all these people who've been advocating for all different kinds of rail to solve a whole range of pollution and transportation problems. Anyway.
It does feel like some of the stuff is the difference between folks who've been thinking about what should be the idea, what's the good idea, and then folks like yourselves who are very movement oriented and bringing that world of the lovingly with love rail nerds into the movement organizer space. So I want to make sure that Nancy gets a chance to say something, and I know we have a little bit of echo. I'll try to deal with that. Okay.
Hi, I think like Kim said, we're excited to work with you all. There's a bunch of information. We're brand new to this. So I'm really looking forward to learn from you all and just see where we go. You know, I see in the future clean air, but it's gonna take a while till we get there. So I'm thankful to be here with you all.
Nancy, thank you for your excellent organizing. It sounds like you jumped right in and you're plowing ahead.
Yeah,
good luck.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you again, Nancy and Kim and everybody who participated in the conversation. I think that's going to close out that section of this call, and we will take a moment then now to for any other sharing that needs to happen from other folks around the organizing that goes forward. And obviously, Nancy and Kim are welcome to stay, but you might find that you have other obligations, and we understand that.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you guys so much. I have to head out to dinner with my kids and my family, but thank you very much and have a lovely evening.
Okay,
You
thank
too.
you so much. Good night.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.